Hello, hello. Welcome back to Chapter 7, Part 2. And we are talking about revolutions in Europe and North America and the philosophical underpinnings of said revolutions. Here are your key terms and the lecture questions for today are: what are the origins and consequences of the French and Haitian revolutions? And secondly, what types of political ideologies emerge from the Revolutionary Age? So, just as a recap of what we were talking about in part 1 of chapter 7, we are talking about major political reforms that are taking place during the Enlightenment period, with the introduction of ideas such as popular sovereignty, right? This idea that political power is dependent upon the people, right? The consent of the governed. In other words, people in positions of political power aren't there just simply because they're inherently, positioned in their life to be there. They're there because people have given them that power. And therefore, if you give somebody power, you can also take that power away. Okay. Along with this is emerging this idea of a nation, and a nation being a collection of people who share common language, common culture, and common history, right? So you're going to start to see the emergence of national identities. This happens slowly. It happens quicker in certain areas than in other parts of Europe. And certainly in the colonies, like the American British colonies, it took some time to transition from an idea of being, a British citizen to being an American citizen, and what does that mean? And then it even takes longer for people to not necessarily identify directly with their geographic region, and more to identify as the idea of being an American generally, right, as a nation, an American identity. And that really doesn't happen until after the Civil War. So this process is very slow, but it's emerging during this time period. We're also talking about challenges to the mercantilist system. The mercantilist economic system, this closed economic system, that really requires a favorable trade balance, that does in many ways motivate colonial expansion in an effort to get access to more and more resources. The idea of free trade is emerging. So the idea being that certain countries specialize in certain things. You don't necessarily have to have everything within your country's boundary, that you could specialize and then you can trade with other countries. And in order to do that, you have to sort of deregulate a lot of these markets, and allow for the markets to play out based on the law of supply and demand. Okay, in addition to that, and sort of part of the argument that went along with Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, was this idea of free labor, using paid labor rather than slave labor. Now, of course, this idea is going to be very slow to catch on, and in a lot of places, it's not the idea of um, abolishing slavery isn't necessarily an economic one. So, for example, in America, we had a civil war, and it took a civil war in order for our country to make a law against slavery. So, this happens in different ways in different places. What we'll see in the French Revolution, for example, we'll start to see this idea of abolishing slavery as being linked to the idea that all men are created equal. But you don't see that so much in the United States, right? So It just depends on where you are, but definitely economic reforms are taking place, and new ideas of how to operate a country's economy is are being um, formed. Okay, so we're going to talk now about one of the most influential political and social revolutions of this time period, the French Revolution. The French Revolution, the dates for it basically originate with the storming of the Bastille and the meeting of the Estates General in 1789, and then 1799 with when Napoleon decides to crown himself Emperor of France. Okay, so those are the two bookends of the French Revolution. We're going to talk now about the original, like, spark that basically sets off the revolution. Okay, so there was a meeting of a political body known as the Estates General, and they decide to call a meeting in May of 1789, basically to address and discuss financial problems and tax problems and all of that that were due to war debt and lavish spending by the monarchy. Okay, the Estates General is made up of three estates. The first estate is the clergy. The second estate is the aristocracy or the nobility. And then the third estate were representatives for the common people. Okay, so they're coming together. They're trying to discuss these financial issues. They're primarily financial issues. The last time that the Estates General had met before 1789 was actually 1614. So it had been a long time, over 100 years, since the Estates General had met. Okay. The way that the Estates General had operated in previous times when they met was that each of the estates got one vote. Okay? So the first estate got one vote, the second estate got one vote, the third estate got one vote. However, when they meet this time around, the members of the third estate wanted to have a more representative style of voting, right? Because they made up the majority of the population. They argued that they should have a proportional number of votes when deciding on, how to move the country forward financially. Okay. In conjunction with this, they are going to end up butting heads, of course, with the first and second estate. But in conjunction with this, a Parisian crowd is going to storm the Bastille, and we're going to talk about that. This is an armory and an infamous political prison, and that happens on July 14th of 1789. Okay. Meanwhile, back at the Estates General meeting, a National Assembly is created by the Third Estate, and they basically decide that they are going to break themselves away from the Estates General, and they're going to abolish all the privileges of the clergy and nobility, and they are going to declare a new era of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And this is generally called the tennis court oath. Okay. So when that happens, they'd also decide that they are basically going to reform the government. When this happens, of course, there's going to be a lot of pushback by the clergy, by the aristocracy, and also by the king. The king at the time is Louis XVI, and he lives in this lavish palace in Versailles on the outskirts of Paris. He has been spending money like mad on construction projects and travel and all sorts of luxury goods. And meanwhile, the people are starving, right? And are hungry, are impoverished, and they are wanting to see a change. So the storming of the Bastille, along with the tennis court oath, basically becomes the seminal events that mark the beginning of the French Revolution. And July 14th is considered like France's July 4th, right? It's celebrated every year. It's a huge, Bastille Day is a huge holiday in France. The reason why they chose the Bastille was for two reasons. One was it was an armory, so it contained weapons that the protesters wanted. But the second was that it was also a notorious jail, a prison for political prisoners. Okay. They had notorious underground cells in which political prisoners would be captured, or held prisoner. The interesting thing is that when the Bastille was stormed in July 14th of 1789, there was only actually 7 inmates there in the prison walls. There were 4 counterfeiters, 2 mentally ill, and 1 count who had been sent there by his family, basically on the grounds that they thought he was mentally ill. There was about 900 protesters altogether, and they wanted access to cannons and gunpowder. Some of them scaled the walls to let down the drawbridge because it's an old castle, so it was very heavily fortified. At the time that these 900 protesters stormed the prison, there was about 82 guards at the time of the storming of the walls and everything. And in the end, 98 protesters are going to end up losing their lives as a result of this storming. Only 1 guard lost his life, but 8 of the protesters will be executed after this in like a show of force by the monarchy and by the elite. Right. But this is really seen as a seminal event because it represents the power of the people, right? The power of the people to challenge the monarchy and this very grand sort of absolute monarchy, the French monarch, right? Louis the 16th. Okay, so the Parisians are pissed and they're protesting, they're going out into the streets, they're being violently put down, and the monarch is ignoring them, and there's no real progress being made politically towards the revolution. So there's a march by a group of women in October 5th, 1789, and they decide that they are going to just go right to the heart of the beast. They are going to march all the way to Versailles. The Palace of Versailles, that was about a 12-mile march outside of the city center of Paris. This march consisted of thousands of angry working women who were frustrated that they could not pay their taxes, even though they were being taxed. They could not feed their children, and their children were hungry, right? And so people were starving, and they decide that they are going to take their protest directly to the gates of the king and queen. When they get to Versailles, the women take the king and the queen hostage, and they march them back to Paris, where they will basically be put into the Tuileries Palace, their apartment that is within the city of Paris. And basically, they're put under a type of house arrest, right? So they're brought there under duress, and they're put there essentially under house arrest, requiring them at that point to start to listen to the revolutionary demands. So, with popular support behind the National Assembly then decides to issue this Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which essentially upheld the natural rights such as liberty and property, similar to the U.S. Declaration of Independence, but it also mandated the adoption of a representative government, equality before the law, and freedom of expression. And as a means of reducing monarchical power and enforcing the mandates of the Declaration, the National Assembly created a new constitution in 1791 and charged a newly formed Legislative Assembly with governing France as a constitutional monarchy and developing legislative reform. But as time went on, this legislative body, the Legislative Assembly, starts to have divisions within itself on how far to go with the revolution and how far, how much power the monarch should have. Some believed in eliminating the monarch altogether. Some believed in keeping the monarchy and then just having a representative government that kind of ruled with the monarchy. So, in this sort of chaos that was taking place, the king and queen decide to try to make a run for it and escape out of the country. So, Marie Antoinette, who was King Louis II or the 16th's wife, was Austrian. And so they had allies in Austria. They were trying to escape France and get to Austria when they were caught. And when they're caught, some of the more radical factions of the assembly wanted to see the king put on trial for treason and essentially killed, which is exactly what ends up happening. But the point to take away from this slide anyway is that there were divisions that began right away within the Legislative Assembly, and basically the countries surrounding France are going to start to put pressure on the Legislative Assembly, and then in 1792 there will be a preemptive war declared against Austria, Prussia, Britain, and Russia. So all of these neighbors surrounding France now are going to start to turn their attention on this revolutionary government. Okay, so not everybody was completely satisfied with the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And the woman that you see in front of you, Olympe de Gouges, she was a playwright and really an outspoken woman for the time period and an advocate for women's rights. She wrote plays and pamphlets about slavery, women's rights, illegitimate children, lots of controversial topics for the time. And she decides that she is going to publish her own Declaration of the Rights of Women and of the Female Citizen. This declaration, which stood in not opposition to the Declaration of the Rights of Man, but stood as a counterpoint to the Declarations of the Rights of Man, emphasized women's equality with men and asserted that women should experience the same rights of citizenship as their male counterparts. She eventually will be killed in the terror era of the revolution, which we are going to talk about next. But her writing still exists. The Declaration for the Rights of Women still exists, and it essentially encapsulates a lot of the struggles and thoughts of a very progressive woman for the time period. When she was killed at the guillotine, she was condemned as a counter-revolutionary and an unnatural woman, which was often the term that was used to describe women who demanded their rights. So before we talk about the terror, we're going to talk about some interesting cultural transformations that take place during the French Revolution. So using this idea of reason and standardization and access and equality and all of those things from the Enlightenment, there were some interesting cultural things that were implemented during the French Revolution, only one of which really sticks with us today. So, the most influential cultural change that happens is the standardization of weights and measurements based on a base 10 system, and that is the metric system. And the metric system was implemented by the French government during the Revolution as a way, like I said, to standardize weights and measurements and things like that, which was a problem because people would get taken advantage of and things were measured differently depending upon where you were. So it made conducting business and things like that difficult. So the map that you see on this slide is actually a map of all of the countries in green that you see there that have since the French Revolution adopted the metric system. So you'll notice that there are just a couple of countries that have not yet adopted the metric system officially, and that is the United States and then areas in Malaysia. And those are literally the two only places on earth that have yet to adopt the metric system. Other things during the French Revolution, everybody had to refer to each other as citizens. And that was a way to, again, sort of standardize titles and not have like a hierarchy when it came to titles. They implemented a 10-hour clock. They implemented a 10-day week, and which is, so you see the 10-hour clock here, you see the 10-day week. The days of the weeks were named after people that were usually mythological figures, gods and goddesses and things like that, in a way to kind of get away from the Christian church. So kind of desecularize, I guess, or to secularize the calendar and make it less about church and church rhythms. And so for all of these reasons, right, the all of French society, but particularly in the larger cities and places like Paris for sure, are really going to undergo major cultural transformations during the revolutionary period. So I mentioned earlier that the King and Queen of France had tried to flee and were making their way to Austria when they were caught. And when they were caught, they were brought back to Paris, where they were imprisoned and put on trial for treason. Their trial declared them guilty, and essentially their sentence was death. Now, if you got a death sentence during the time of the French Revolution, chances were you were going to be beheaded by the guillotine. The guillotine was a contraption that was created to essentially execute people in a more humane way than hanging. And, of course, it has a gigantic blade that comes down and chops off the head of the accused. And on January 21st of 1793, Louis XVI will be executed by the guillotine in a public square. And then 9 months later, his wife Marie Antoinette will also be executed by the guillotine. And essentially, you're going to see a time period emerge in the revolution that we generally refer to as the Terror. And it's called the Terror because of the number of people that were killed in a relatively short period of time. Basically, what you have is a group of reformers and radicals within the revolution that start to believe that the only way to really have a successful revolution is basically to kill all of your enemies. Anybody who opposes the revolution, anybody who questions the revolution, anybody who shows signs of being sympathetic to the monarchy. And lawyer Maximilien Robespierre becomes sort of the figurehead for this terror movement. He is a member of the Committee of Public Safety, and essentially their job was to evaluate who were enemies of the state, right? Who were enemies of the revolution. Um, Also happening at the same time, of course, is this war that the French are having to fight with the surrounding countries. So while the terror is happening, there is also a military being built up at the same time. An army of about 800,000 soldiers is being equipped and basically mobilized in order to fight these wars with the surrounding countries. Meanwhile, back at home, the Committee of Public Safety is determining who the enemies of the states are, and essentially about 40,000 peasants and laborers and just common people that were labeled enemies of the people were executed during the Reign of Terror. And they were executed publicly, and they were executed using the guillotine. There was a huge uproar against this after a while, after it had been going on for a while. And eventually, the more moderate revolutionaries in 1794 will take back control of the government, take back control from the Committee of Public Safety, and Robespierre will be arrested and he will be tried and he will eventually die himself at the guillotine in July of 1794, along with 21 of his very loyal followers. Once that happens, a new form of government called the Directory will essentially take over control of the government, and this will eventually, well, it leads to the Directory is a committee of 5 members, and they will govern France from 1795 until 1799. And they had a lot of issues that they had to deal with from the very beginning, primarily finances, which were just a mess in France. There was a lot of infighting. There was a lot of continued wars, obviously, that they're still fighting on the outside, and they're also the Directory is also engaging in political oppression and basically killing their enemies as well. They're just not doing it quite to the scale that was happening during the Terror. Because of the instability of the Directory, eventually one person will come out as sort of the leader or the strongest politician, if you will, and that will be Napoleon Bonaparte. And he will stage a coup of the Directory and essentially install something called the Consulate, that is a 3-man council that will essentially govern the country of France. So we are now going to talk about Napoleon. So Napoleon is sort of a larger than life figure, really, in French history. He was born on August 15th in 1769 on the island of Corsica, and he actually did not speak French all that well. But in 1778, he goes to France to attend the Royal Military College in northern France. He actually didn't like it all that much. He hated it, but he stuck it out and he eventually graduated. He didn't have a lot of friends because, like I said, he barely spoke French. And in 1789, when the revolution began, he was just 20 years old, and he actually welcomed the change. He thought that the French nobility had serious problems, and he thought that the old order needed to be revitalized. Um, but he doesn't really participate directly in the revolution, at least not at first. He actually tries to go to Corsica and establish himself there, but he's shunned there by the government. And he returns to France in 1793. So that's going to be right around the time of the Terror and everything. He goes back to France. He enlists in the military. He becomes an artillery captain, and he immediately becomes very popular with his men because he led from the front. He had a lot of loyalty of the people that followed him. And at 26 years old, because of his bravery and because of his military victories, he's made a general and commander of the Army of the Interior. He has multiple victories in Austria, in Italy, and also in Egypt. And in your on canvas, there is a video that talks about his victories in Egypt. And really, when he returns back from Egypt, is when he is going to carry out this coup, which he stages in November 9th of 1799. And he basically comes to power with the consulate, right? And this is a 3-person consulate. At the time that this happens, he's only 30 years old. But in 1804, he decides that he is going to crown himself emperor and essentially take away, strip power from everybody else. He launched multiple military campaigns. He was a master propagandist. He knew how to self-promote himself. He claimed to champion the ideas of liberty, equality, fraternity. He kept in place a lot of the transformations that had taken place as a result of the revolution, but he took control completely and totally politically. He, in 1812, decides to launch a massive invasion of Russia, and this will end up costing him not a lot of money, a lot of troops, and he basically is forced to retreat his army because of the harsh winter and the fact that the Moscow had essentially been abandoned by the time they got there. Only a sixth of his men will actually return from this Russia campaign. The Peninsular War in Spain breaks out, and that's going to end up weakening France militarily, and also causing a lot of money to be sent to fight those wars as well. By the time we get to 1815, the major European powers have united to defeat Napoleon, and he will be defeated in Belgium in the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. After this defeat, he is sent into exile on the island of Elba. And after 10 months of spending his time in exile, he will escape. He returns for 100 days, and eventually his European allies will attack him, like I said, at Waterloo in 1815, and he will be sent to a second exile on the island of St. Helena off the coast of Africa, where he will die in 1821. So he is a very controversial figure because he, in some ways, had a lot of accomplishments. That he certainly had a lot of military accomplishments, and he did, in some ways, continue with the revolutionary ideals. But he, of course, wanted to rule as an authoritarian and as a dictator, and so there was a lot of problems with it. He has a famous quote. He says, "I found the crown of France in the gutter and I picked it up." And so he literally just felt as if the country needed solid, guidance and leadership. And but he was very, very power hungry, obviously, with his multiple military campaigns. Again, there are videos in Canvas that you can link to learn more about the Napoleonic era. And here you can see a map that shows the extent of Napoleon's empire in 1812. And you can see the campaign that he will wage against the Russians, a failed campaign. All the areas that you see there in that peach color are part of the French Empire, and all of the areas that you see in the striped color, peach color, are actually under French control. So, kind of writing along the same lines as the French Revolution is the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution lasts from 1791 to 1804, and it is a revolution that is carried out on the island of Saint-Domingue, which later on will become Haiti and the Dominican Republic. On Saint-Domingue, you have hundreds of thousands of enslaved people, and they were working primarily on sugar plantations, which was very brutal work and typically came along with a very short lifetime. And it also produced a lot of violence and oppression on these massive plantations. And so you start to get a revolutionary movement there. Interestingly enough, the revolution actually begins not with the enslaved population, but with the Creole population, the mixed race population there, that basically wanted to have more political rights, but then it spreads to the island slave population. And that's when you're going to get, these massive protests, these massive revolts that will eventually lead to massive battles. So there was about 40,000 French white settlers there, mostly plantation owners, and about 30,000 free people of color. So that tells you about how many there were, that about 30,000 of these Creoles really were not, wanting to have more political power, because they didn't have as much political power as the white French settlers. But again, it very quickly becomes about equality and power for everybody, right? Using the language really of the French Revolution. And after 1789, the whites will campaign for self-government, while slaves will use the language of the revolution to call for freedom. So there's really two movements that are happening. They're happening simultaneously, but they will culminate in the outbreak of the Haitian Revolution. Because of a lot of pressure regarding these ideas of equality, in 1793, the French National Convention will abolish slavery. But ultimately, it's not enough, because there's all of these social stratifications within these colonies, these enslaved people, or even formerly enslaved people, and they want political power. And the white colonists are not going to give up their political power. So that's really where the struggle culminates in Haiti. And eventually in 1804, the French government under Napoleon is going to go ahead and relinquish the power, and the country of Haiti will be formed. This will be the first country to be established by formerly enslaved people, and it does become a huge inspiration for enslaved people throughout the world. And particularly in British North America, where you had a lot of enslaved people that existed, this becomes seen as a real threat to the enslavers in these colonies surrounding Haiti. So British North America, but also the Caribbean and other places as well. So the Haitian Revolution, while the French Revolution is like this really sort of intense, violent, but also politically charged revolution, the Haitian Revolution is very much tied to the oppression that enslaved people feel within the context of all of these Enlightenment ideas that are being talked about. And that's the thing about ideas, right? You can't just keep them locked on lockdown, because once they are out there, like people know about them and they become inspiring. So the result of all this revolutionary upheaval and chaos is really going to culminate in new political philosophies and ideologies that are going to be very influential moving into the modern era. And one of the most politically influential ideologies is this idea of nationalism. The idea of nationalism is that you're essentially putting your country's interest, your nation's interest, above all international concerns. And you're focusing on, building up your nation state, building up your economy, building up your military, etc. The Napoleonic era and the Napoleonic Wars in Europe were deeply troubling to a lot of people living in Europe. And many people in Europe wanted to have a sense of stability. They wanted to have a sense of a strong, leader that will essentially unite people. And this idea of having a common language and religion and all of that history becomes very important. This idea becomes extremely influential in places like Germany and Italy. And in Germany, there was groups of principalities in these, small regional areas. And then in Italy, there were these little nation states that existed all up and down the Italian peninsula. And by the time we get to 1870s, both of these regions are going to solidify their principalities and their nation states into one single country of Germany and Italy. And this becomes very important, obviously, moving forward into the 20th century as those countries sort of evolve, and we eventually will get very strong fascist movements within these countries by the time we get into the 20th century. But this idea of nationalism, at least initially, was more of a way to find peace and reconciliation in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars. All right, so another major political philosophy to emerge out of this age of revolution is liberalism. And we've talked about Locke, John Locke, and his two treatises. And basically, John Locke's emphasis on the consent of the governed and natural rights of life, liberty, and property is really the basis of political liberalism. It also promotes limited government and the right to oppose any political authority that does not carry the consent of the people. These goals can be ensured by imposing limits on government authority and guaranteeing rights to all citizens in a written constitution. Religious toleration and the separation of church and state also become fundamental principles of liberalism in the 18th century. All of this plays a significant role in shaping the revolutionary movements that we have talked about in British North American colonies, in Haiti, and in France. And in all of the constitutions there is an assertion of the sovereignty of the people. Enlightenment ideas of natural rights, tested through a series of revolutions, developed into a lasting commitment to consent of the government and equality before the law in the liberal political philosophies of the 19th century. One of the most celebrated proponents of liberalism in the 19th century was the English philosopher John Stuart Mill, who you see pictured there. He argued for the protection of individual rights from censorship and tyranny in his book called the On Liberty, which was published in 1859. Here in the book, he emphasizes this importance of toleration and stress that multiple ethical codes could coexist peacefully in a given society. Mill asserted that people should be free to make ethical choices governing their own lives without government intrusion or obstruction. As an advocate of equality, he also was a supporter of women's rights, and he wrote another essay called On the Subjugation of Women, which played an influential role in the women's rights movement. So liberalism looked a little bit different in the 18th and 19th century than probably how we would think of it today. But this idea of limiting government to allow for personal freedoms, freedoms of expression, and definitely representative government and popular sovereignty, the protection of private property, the protection of civil rights, the protection of people to be able to coexist with multiple ethical codes. These were all really important ideas that will be enshrined in the constitutions of these revolutionary movements. So while liberalism and nationalism represented this continuation of Enlightenment ideals of natural rights and liberty, the rise of conservatism, on the other hand, was a reaction against the ideological changes and increased freedoms that were associated with the revolutionary era. And most conservatives realized that there was no returning back to a pre-revolutionary time period, but they did advocate for some type of central governing authority. They believed that religious doctrine should play a central role in maintaining social order and stability. Conservative theorists like Edmund Burke, moreover, asserted that individual rights were secondary to the rights of the community, and that only acceptable way to generate political change was slowly and gradually rather than through revolution. Some very influential conservatives in places around Europe, most notably Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Great Britain, decided to make an agreement that was really based a lot on conservative principles. And this will basically culminate in the Congress of Vienna of 1815. And essentially what they wanted was they hoped that the only way they hoped to maintain stability in Europe. And the argument was that the only way to really do that was to restore the legitimacy of overthrown monarchs. And the argument was that the monarchs represented traditional beliefs and institutions, and that the monarchs could also exert a firm hand that would demand loyalty from their subjects, and sort of would create a stable environment. They also hoped that by restoring these monarchies, it would maintain some type of political equilibrium and balance of power in Europe to ensure that no single country could conquer others. And again, this is in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars. They agreed to divide military and political power more equitably amongst themselves. Um, And the peace settlement of 1850 was essentially intended to restrain liberalism and nationalism of the Revolutionary era. However, there was an underestimation made by these leaders to the extent of popular support for these ideologies. And in certain places, like the United States and France, these ideologies had become permanently ingrained in the ideologies of the nations. So, although the people at the Congress of Vienna had good intentions and they wanted to see stability, and maybe they wanted to roll back some of the more radical elements of the Revolutionary era, they're still going to ultimately come up against resistance in the future, because there is a lot of popular support for these ideologies such as nationalism and liberalism. All right, well, that's all for now, and I hope you all have a good rest of your day. Take care.